September 11th, 2001. A clear, quiet morning. The world was about to change forever. This is Echoes of History. In the final quiet hours before dawn on September 11th, 2001, New York City looked peaceful, powerful, and unsuspecting. The streets, usually buzzing with noise, were unusually calm. Taxi headlights glowed across empty avenues. Steam rose from manholes. The skyscrapers shimmered with their usual constellation of office lights, flickering against the dark sky. At 3 a.m., most of the city slept. But thousands remained awake. Subway workers repairing tracks, janitors cleaning office floors, newspaper trucks rolling toward their delivery points, security guards drinking coffee to stay alert. New York never slept, but at this hour, it breathed slower. Across the East River, the Twin Towers stood like silent giants. Only a handful of workers remained inside: technicians, security staff, overnight maintenance teams. Their voices echoed through empty floors. Computers hummed softly in the darkness. No one inside could have imagined the building would not survive the day. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, a plan years in the making quietly moved forward. Several men woke before dawn. They dressed in ordinary clothing. They prayed. They checked their bags one last time. They stepped into hotel lobbies, into rental cars, into taxis, appearing no different from any other travelers. They had a schedule to follow. At Portland International Jetport, two men walked across a quiet terminal at 5:45 a.m. They passed security without incident. The checkpoint process in 2001 was simple. Shoes stayed on, liquids weren't inspected, and ID checks were minimal. They blended in perfectly. The security cameras captured them walking calmly toward their gate. Back in New York, early commuters began appearing. Coffee shops rolled up their shutters. The first buses left their depots. A soft orange glow outlined the horizon. The city had no idea it was watching its final peaceful sunrise before the world changed forever. By 4:30 a.m., New York began its slow transition from night to morning. Delivery trucks rattled over cobblestones in lower Manhattan. Street vendors pushed their carts into position, preparing for the flood of commuters. The Hudson River reflected the faint purple of the approaching sunrise. Inside the World Trade Center, overnight security guards checked monitors, walked long, dim corridors, and prepared to end their shifts. A few workers on higher floors typed quietly, catching up on deadlines before the official workday began. Some listened to radios, some read newspapers. None had any reason to think the building they were inside would become the center of a global catastrophe. Meanwhile, airports along the East Coast began to fill with early travelers. At Boston, Logan International Airport, morning flights were preparing to board. Business travelers in crisp suits, families with children, college students returning to school. Everyone moved with the relaxed rhythm of a normal Tuesday. At 5:30 a.m., the men involved in the unfolding plot began positioning themselves. Some headed directly to their departure gates. Others made quiet phone calls. Their faces showed no panic, no hesitation. They blended into the crowd with chilling ease. At 6 a.m., the city was fully awake. Radios announced, "Clear skies today, warm temperatures, ideal flying weather." Indeed, the sky was a perfect blue from Washington to Boston, a pilot's dream. Commuters crossed bridges, firefighters finished overnight shifts, people poured into subway stations, and in the middle of all this movement, several men, scattered in airports along the East Coast, were preparing to take control of 4 aircraft. At 6:20 a.m., boarding began for American Airlines Flight 11, the flight that would soon tear into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Nobody at the gate sensed anything unusual. Flight attendants greeted passengers warmly. Boarding passes beeped as they were scanned. Among the passengers were men whose faces concealed the intentions that would change the world. At 6:30 a.m., sunlight spilled over New York City. The Twin Towers reflected the glowing morning sky like two colossal mirrors. Tourists walked through the plaza below, taking photos, sipping coffee, unaware they had less than 3 hours left. In Manhattan's financial district, traders logged into computers, scanning early reports. Phones rang, coffee brewed. Everything felt routine. Meanwhile, boarding continued across 3 major airports. United Airlines Flight 175 prepared for takeoff. American Airlines Flight 77, departing from Washington Dulles, loaded passengers calmly. United Airlines Flight 93, in Newark, waited at the gate, running slightly behind schedule. Inside the cockpits, pilots ran checklists. They joked with co-pilots, tested controls, and followed procedures practiced hundreds of times before. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. At 6:45 a.m., the skies across the East Coast remained perfectly clear. A flawless morning. Families said final goodbyes. Business travelers reviewed presentations. Tourists looked out airplane windows at the rising sun. At 6:50 a.m., ground crews confirmed fuel levels. Cargo doors closed. Staff waved signals to pilots. At 7 a.m., America's aviation network reached full activity. Flights lifted off from airports across the region, arching into the blue sky. And among them, several planes carried men who were minutes away from ending the lives of thousands. By 7:10 a.m., all 4 flights connected to the coming tragedy were fully boarded or moments from departure. Passengers settled into seats, fastening seatbelts, adjusting air vents, greeting flight attendants. Some listened to portable CD players, others read paperback novels. A few closed their eyes to sleep through the flight. At 7:15 a.m., turbulence forecasts came in. Smooth air, no issues expected. The pilots acknowledged calmly. Inside the cabins, nothing felt unusual, except among the men who were silently preparing for what they believed was their final mission. At 7:20 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 lifted off from Boston Logan Airport, climbing into the crystal blue sky. Air traffic control watched the radar blip rise smoothly. 3 minutes later, the second flight, United 175, rolled toward the runway. Across downtown Manhattan, the morning rush intensified. Thousands of workers stepped out of subway stations. Office elevators filled. Coffee shops overflowed with customers. In fire stations, firefighters cleaned equipment, unaware of the unimaginable calls they were hours away from receiving. At 7:30 a.m., news stations broadcast cheerful morning headlines. Weather updates sounded optimistic. Sports results scrolled across screens. Everything was normal. At 7:35, the sun fully illuminated the Twin Towers. The buildings glowed bright against the clear sky. Inside the 4 planes, passengers had no idea their fates were already sealed. The world was minutes away from entering the darkest morning of a generation, and the last normal moment in America was quietly ticking away. By 7:40 a.m., the East Coast was fully awake. The morning rush filled streets, subway cars, and office buildings. But amidst this ordinary day, the first signs of a planned tragedy were already in motion. Passengers lined up for boarding at multiple airports, unaware that some fellow travelers carried intentions that would change the course of history. At Boston Logan Airport, American Airlines Flight 11 moved steadily toward takeoff. Passengers chatted quietly, some still sipping coffee from paper cups. Flight attendants completed pre-flight checks, adjusting overhead bins and reviewing safety procedures. Among the boarding crowd, 5 men moved calmly. Nothing about their demeanor revealed the horror that would unfold in less than an hour. They took their seats, fastening their seatbelts, folding their hands in their laps, blending perfectly with the unsuspecting travelers around them. Simultaneously, United Airlines Flight 175 was preparing at another gate. Business travelers, families, and tourists waited patiently. Crew members offered polite smiles and instructions. The hum of jet engines in the distance was ordinary background noise, but behind the masks of normalcy, the orchestrated plan was quietly ticking forward. At 8 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 began taxiing toward the runway at Washington Dulles Airport. The pilots followed standard protocol, communicating with air traffic control, adjusting instruments, unaware that this flight would soon become a weapon. Nearby passengers chatted about vacations, meetings, or the early morning news. The ordinary moments of their lives would be shattered within minutes. Flight 93, departing from Newark, was still preparing. Passengers walked slowly down the jet bridge. Flight attendants smiled and assisted with seating. No alarms sounded, no red flags raised. The sky remained clear, the perfect setting for what was about to unfold. The coordinated timetable for the attacks ensured that each plane would depart at staggered intervals, allowing simultaneous chaos within a short time frame. Air traffic control monitored all flights as usual, seeing nothing unusual. From their perspective, the morning was uneventful, just another Tuesday. At 8:15 a.m., the engines of Flight 11 roared into life, propelling the aircraft into the clear morning sky. The hum of the jet became a distant whisper as it climbed above the clouds, its passengers oblivious to the impending disaster. Three more planes followed in sequence, carrying unsuspecting travelers alongside those who intended to carry out a mass attack. New York, Washington, and the entire eastern seaboard were about to witness the unthinkable. But in this moment, all was calm, all was ordinary, and the sun rose steadily above a city that would never be the same again. By 8:30 a.m., the skies over the East Coast were clear, the sun casting long shadows across airports, streets, and rivers. American Airlines Flight 11 had already lifted off from Boston, climbing steadily into the crisp morning sky. Flight attendants continued their rounds, offering drinks and safety instructions. Passengers settled into their seats, chatting softly, reading newspapers, or closing their eyes for a few minutes of rest. Everything seemed ordinary, calm, mundane, yet unseen, a deadly plan was unfolding. United Airlines Flight 175 followed shortly after. Engines roared to life, wings flexed, tires lifted from the tarmac. Inside, pilots followed standard checklists, interacting naturally with co-pilots. Passengers glanced out windows at the rising sun, noting Manhattan's skyline in the distance. For them, it was a routine flight, like thousands every morning. For a few, however, it was the last ordinary moment they would ever know. At Washington Dulles, American Airlines Flight 77 began its taxi to the runway. Passengers boarded with smiles, children held hands with parents, and crew members greeted each with professional courtesy. Engines purred as the aircraft rolled forward. Outside, the control tower signaled clear takeoff. Nothing appeared abnormal. Yet within minutes, this aircraft would become an instrument of destruction. Meanwhile, United Airlines Flight 93 in Newark was preparing for departure. Boarding continued. Passengers moved through the jet bridge with quiet conversation. Flight attendants assisted travelers, ensuring luggage stowed and seatbelts fastened. Security checks were routine, minimal by modern standards. For those unaware, these moments were the last remnants of normalcy in the skies above America. As each plane rose into the morning light, coordination ensured the attacks would occur almost simultaneously. Air traffic controllers watched as four separate aircraft followed standard flight paths, oblivious to the intentions of a small group on board. Across airports and cities, the world operated as it always had, unaware of the tragedy about to unfold. By 8:45 a.m., Flight 11 was approaching New York airspace. Flight 175 climbed behind it. Flight 77 ascended toward Washington, and Flight 93 prepared to cross New Jersey. Each aircraft carried passengers going about their ordinary lives, some oblivious, some complicit. The timing was precise, rehearsed, and lethal. The morning air was clear, the sun bright, yet the calm was a fragile veneer masking chaos that would erupt in mere minutes. At this moment, America was still unshaken. Children walked to school, office workers entered elevators, taxis filled the streets. But in the cabins of four planes, destiny was set in motion, ready to rewrite history forever. At 8:46 a.m., the ordinary Tuesday morning in New York City shattered. American Airlines Flight 11, a Boeing 767, slammed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center between the 93rd and 99th floors. The impact was sudden, violent, and devastating. Glass shattered, metal twisted, and an enormous fireball erupted from the upper floors. The building shuddered, sending tremors through the streets below. A plume of smoke rose rapidly, black and thick, filling the skyline with the unmistakable image of catastrophe. People in lower Manhattan froze, staring at the inferno. Commuters stumbled on sidewalks, taxi drivers stopped in the streets, and bystanders gasped in disbelief. Inside the tower, alarms screamed. Office workers scrambled for stairwells, some clutching their phones, others dragging colleagues along. The roar of the engines and the violent crash echoed in a terrifying symphony of destruction. Across the city, air traffic controllers and emergency responders were immediately aware that something catastrophic had occurred. Planes were grounded, and alarms went off at airports up and down the East Coast. On the streets, people called loved ones, trying to understand what had happened. The first images flashed across television screens nationwide, smoke pouring from the upper floors of the North Tower, chaos unfolding in real time. Meanwhile, United Airlines Flight 175 was still climbing, unaware that it would soon repeat the horror in the South Tower. Flight attendants continued routine procedures, passengers looked out windows, and the pilots navigated as though any ordinary flight. But the first impact had already changed the course of the day. The city's emergency services were mobilizing rapidly, unaware that the disaster would soon multiply. Firefighters, police, and emergency medical personnel converged on Lower Manhattan. Radios crackled with confusion and urgency. Command centers mobilized. Streets were cordoned off. Civilians were evacuated where possible, but thousands remained trapped in and around the towers. By 8:50 a.m., the magnitude of the attack was undeniable. Smoke engulfed the North Tower, fire roared, and debris rained down onto streets below. The city that had seemed invincible only minutes earlier now faced an unimaginable threat. New York City, and indeed the nation, was witnessing the first strike of an orchestrated assault that would claim thousands of lives. At 9:03 a.m., the calm morning shattered once again. United Airlines Flight 175, climbing toward Manhattan, collided violently with the South Tower of the World Trade Center, hitting between the 77th and 85th floors. A massive explosion erupted, fire and smoke engulfing the building. Windows shattered, steel beams twisted, and sheets of paper and debris poured onto the streets below. The skyline, once a symbol of strength, was now marred by fire and smoke rising from two towers. On the streets, chaos intensified. New Yorkers ran in every direction, some looking up in disbelief, others screaming, as the magnitude of the attacks became undeniable. Dust and ash covered the sidewalks, mixing with shards of glass from the upper floors. Emergency sirens screamed across the city, blending with the cries of bystanders. Inside the South Tower, office workers struggled to evacuate. Smoke filled stairwells. Panic set in as elevators were rendered useless, leaving thousands of people trapped. Many made their way down the staircases, clutching loved ones, helping colleagues, or sending frantic calls to family members. The scene was harrowing, a mixture of courage, confusion, and desperation. Across the city, emergency services coordinated a response. Firefighters, police, and paramedics streamed toward the scene. Some had already been responding to the North Tower impact, and now they faced a second, simultaneous catastrophe. Command centers relayed instructions. Streets were closed. Buses and taxis moved people away from the danger zones, though the scale of the disaster made complete evacuation impossible. Air traffic control across the East Coast implemented emergency procedures. All incoming flights were redirected or grounded. Pilots and controllers began the painstaking work of accounting for all aircraft, unaware that several more planes were still en route to their targets. Media outlets, just moments before reporting the first impact, now covered a second strike. Television anchors spoke in stunned disbelief as live footage showed smoke pouring from the South Tower. News vans and journalists gathered near the scene, documenting the unfolding tragedy. For millions watching at home, the unimaginable had become real. By 9:10 a.m., it was clear. This was no accident. The coordinated attacks were a deliberate act of terror, targeting the heart of New York City. Thousands of lives hung in the balance. Amid the chaos, individual stories of bravery, survival, and heartbreak were beginning to emerge. Emergency workers charging into burning buildings, civilians assisting neighbors, and people making their final phone calls. The city had entered its darkest morning, but the resilience and courage of its people were already beginning to surface.